Margaret's morning ritual remained unchanged since Robert's passing 5 years ago. Wake at sunrise, brew a pot of Earl Grey tea, and spend the first quiet moments watching the century-old apple tree through her kitchen window. The tree had been there long before she was born, planted by her grandfather William during the Great Depression, or so she'd been told countless times during her childhood. This morning felt heavier than usual. Her tea tasted unusually bitter, and the sight of the tree made her heart sink. The majestic apple tree that had stood sentinel over their family property for nearly 90 years was dying. Its once proud branches, which used to burst with pink blossoms each spring and provide bountiful harvests each fall, now drooped listlessly. Dark patches mottled its ancient trunk, and the few apples it managed to produce fell prematurely, attracting wasps and creating a mess she could barely manage with her arthritis-stiffened fingers. "Oh, Grandpa Will," she whispered, pressing her weathered palm against the cool window pane. "What would you say if you could see it now?" The tree had been more than just a plant to their family. It was the keeper of their memories, the silent witness to 4 generations of joys and sorrows. She remembered the wooden swing her grandfather had crafted for her mother in the 1930s, hanging from the tree's strongest branch. The rope marks were still visible in the bark, though the swing itself had long since disappeared. During the scorching summers of her childhood, her mother would spread quilts beneath its sprawling canopy, where 3 generations would gather, to share stories, sandwiches, and the sweet tart apples that seemed to taste better than any store-bought fruit. Margaret set her teacup in the sink and made her way to the back door, her slippers whispering against the worn linoleum. Her joints protested as she descended the wooden steps into the yard, but she pushed through the discomfort. The morning dew soaked through her slippers, but she barely noticed as she stood beneath the tree's thinning canopy. If she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend nothing had changed, that her grandfather was still alive, tending his beloved garden with calloused hands that somehow remained gentle enough to handle the season's first blossoms, that her mother was still in the kitchen, baking her famous apple pies, that Robert was just inside, preparing their breakfast and planning another day of retirement together. But reality had a way of asserting itself. A branch creaked ominously overhead, and when she looked up, she could see patches of sky through, gaps where leaves should have been. The bark beneath her fingers felt loose, crumbling away at her touch. The tree wasn't just sick, it was becoming dangerous. She'd been avoiding this decision for months, perhaps even years. Each spring, she'd tell herself the tree just needed time, that it would recover once the weather warmed. But each year brought further decline, fewer blossoms, smaller apples, and now the branches themselves were beginning to rot. Back inside, Margaret picked up her phone and stared at the business card she'd been avoiding for weeks. Davidson's tree service was printed in bold letters, the card's edges worn from her nervous handling. Her neighbor, Helen, had recommended them after noticing the tree's deteriorating condition. Her thumb hovered over the phone's keypad as memories flooded her mind. She thought about the day her grandfather had taught her mother to make his special apple butter, a recipe he'd learned from his own mother. The whole house would smell of cinnamon and cloves, and even now, decades later, that scent brought her back to those autumn afternoons. The arthritis in her fingers flared as she gripped the phone tighter. At 72, she wasn't ancient, but her body seemed determined to remind her of every passing year. Like the tree, she supposed, everything aged, everything changed, nothing lasted forever. "Stop being foolish," she muttered to herself. "It's just a tree." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It was her grandfather's legacy, a living piece of family history. Every spring, it had burst into clouds of pale pink blossoms that filled her yard with their delicate fragrance. Every summer, it had provided shade for reading and afternoon naps. Every fall it had given them fruit for pies, butter and cider. And every winter its bare branches had stood strong against the snow and wind, a promise that spring would return. Now, though, it was becoming a liability. The last storm had sent a substantial branch crashing onto her garden shed. She was lucky it hadn't hit the house, or worse, injured someone. Being sentimental wouldn't change the fact that the tree was dying, and keeping it standing was becoming dangerous. With a deep breath, Margaret pressed the numbers. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Davidson's tree service, a friendly voice said. "Hello," Margaret replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I need someone to look at an old apple tree. I think it needs to come down." As she made the appointment for later that week, Margaret felt a weight settle in her chest. It was the right decision, she knew that, but it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend, like erasing another piece of her history. She had no way of knowing that this decision would unearth far more than just the tree's roots. It would excavate secrets her grandfather had buried decades ago, secrets that would reshape everything she thought she knew about her family's past. The morning Brian Davidson arrived. The sky hung low and grey, threatening rain. Margaret had spent a restless night, rising several times to gaze out her bedroom window at the tree's familiar silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Now she stood in her kitchen, clutching a fresh cup of tea, watching a white truck with Davidson's tree service emblazoned on its side pull into her driveway. A tall man in work boots and a reflective safety vest stepped out, followed by two younger workers. He walked with the confident stride of someone who knew their business, carrying a tablet and what looked like specialized measuring equipment. Margaret opened the door before he could ring the bell. "Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Brian Davidson. We spoke on the phone about your apple tree." His handshake was firm but gentle, and his voice carried the same friendly tone she remembered from their call. Up close, she could see smile lines around his eyes and flecks of silver in his dark beard. Something about his manner put her at ease. "Yes, please come through," she said, leading him around the side of the house. "I've had this tree my whole life. Well, technically longer. My grandfather planted it during the Depression. He always said it was his investment in the future." Brian nodded sympathetically as they walked. "Old trees like this, they become part of the family, don't they? I hate having to remove them, but sometimes it's necessary. Mind if I take a look?" Margaret watched as Brian circled the tree, occasionally stopping to make notes on his tablet. He ran his hands over the bark, peered up into the branches, and tapped various spots on the trunk. His expression grew increasingly serious with each inspection. "I'm afraid the news isn't good, Mrs. Sullivan," he said finally. "The rot's extensive. See these dark patches? They go deep into the heartwood. And these cracks here," he pointed to several long fissures running up the trunk. "They're structural weaknesses. One good storm could split this tree right down the middle." Margaret nodded, having expected this verdict but still feeling her heart sink. "So it has to come down?" "I'm afraid so. And sooner rather than later for safety's sake. We can do it. Today, if you'd like. I've got my full crew with me and the weather's holding." Margaret watched from her back steps as Brian's crew began their work. They started with the smaller branches, carefully cutting and lowering them with ropes. Each crack of breaking wood made her wince. The younger workers moved efficiently, calling out to each other as they worked their way down the tree. Brian supervised, occasionally helping to guide a larger branch safely to the ground. The process was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Margaret had expected more chaos, more destruction, but there was something almost respectful about the way they dismantled the tree piece by piece. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching a funeral. By mid-morning, they had stripped away most of the crown, leaving only the main trunk and largest branches. The yard looked strange and empty without the tree's familiar canopy. Margaret had gone inside several times, unable to watch, but always found herself drawn back to the window or the back steps. Her hands shook as she made another cup of tea, and she nearly dropped the cup when she heard Brian's chainsaw start up. "All right, we're ready to take down the main trunk," Brian called out to his crew. The saw's noise shattered the relative quiet that had settled over the yard. Margaret watched as he began cutting through the base of the trunk, the saw throwing out sprays of sawdust. Suddenly Brian's posture changed. He switched off the saw and stepped back, frowning. Kneeling down, he peered into the cut he'd made, then pulled a flashlight from his vest pocket and shone it into the gap. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called, his voice different now, tighter, more controlled. "Could you come here for a moment?" Margaret made her way across the yard, her heart beating faster at Brian's strange tone. As she got closer, she could see that his face had lost its usual friendly expression. He looked worried, almost afraid. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I need you to stay back," Brian said firmly, putting out his arm to stop her from getting too close to the trunk. "There's something inside the tree, something metal, and it's not a nail or any kind of normal hardware." Margaret felt her stomach twist. "What do you mean? What is it?" Brian ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of sawdust. "I can't be certain, but it looks like it could be some kind of military equipment. Old. World War II era, maybe. Earlier. It's hard to tell with all the wood growth around it, but I've seen enough in my line of work to know we need to call the police." The world seemed to tilt slightly under Margaret's feet. Military equipment. In her grandfather's apple tree. It didn't make sense. But Brian was already pulling out his phone, his other hand still extended to keep her back from the trunk. "I don't understand," she said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "How could there be military equipment in my tree? My grandfather planted it. He would have known." She trailed off as a memory surfaced. Her grandfather, years ago, telling her never to dig too deep around the tree's roots. She'd always assumed he was worried about damaging them, but now Brian was speaking to someone on the phone, his voice calm and professional despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "Yes, that's right. No, it hasn't been disturbed beyond the initial cut. Yes, we've cleared the area. The address is 1247 Maple Street." Margaret sank onto one of the garden chairs, her legs suddenly weak. Above her, the grey sky had finally opened up, and a light rain began to fall. She barely noticed it, her mind spinning with questions. What else had her quiet, hard-working grandfather never told them about the tree? What other secrets had he planted in their backyard all those years ago? The police arrived with surprising speed, their cruiser's lights painting Margaret's quiet suburban street in alternating flashes of red and blue. She watched from her front porch as neighbors emerged, from their homes gathering in small clusters on their lawns to whisper and point. Helen from next door waved and started walking over, but a young officer politely intercepted her, establishing a perimeter with yellow tape. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Detective Sarah Chen," a woman in plain clothes said, approaching Margaret with a badge in hand. "Could we talk inside?" Margaret led the detective into her kitchen, where her half-empty teapot still sat on the warmer. The familiar space felt different now, almost alien, with a police detective sitting at her worn oak table. Through the window, she could see more officials arriving, vehicles marked with bomb squad and emergency response team. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret asked automatically, falling back on habits of hospitality to keep herself grounded. "No, thank you." Detective Chen pulled out a small notebook. "I understand this is overwhelming, but I need you to tell me everything you know about this tree. When was it planted? Has anyone ever worked on it before today?" Margaret wrapped her hands around her own teacup, now cold. "My grandfather, William Barrett, planted it in 1933. He was particular about it, wouldn't let anyone else prune it or work on it. I always thought it was just because he was proud of it. And your grandfather's full name and occupation? William James Barrett. He was a mechanic, worked at the railroad yards until he retired. He passed away in 1982. The detective's pen moved quickly across the page. "Was he a veteran, Mrs. Sullivan?" The question caught Margaret off guard. "Yes, World War I. He served in France. He didn't talk about it much. Why? These kinds of discoveries often have connections to military service. Chen's voice was gentle, but professional. Did he ever mention anything about keeping military equipment or memorabilia? Margaret shook her head, then stopped. Wait, there was something. A story he used to tell about a supply depot in France. Something about soldiers hiding things in trees. I always thought it was just a story to entertain me when I was little. A burst of activity outside drew their attention. The bomb squad had arrived in full gear, their bulky protective suits making them look like astronauts as they carefully approached the tree. Through the kitchen window, Margaret watched as they set up their equipment, working methodically, taking photographs, and scanning the tree with devices she didn't recognize. Brian Davidson was still there, pointing out exactly where he'd made the discovery. His crew had packed up their equipment and moved their truck down the street, but Brian stayed, talking with various officials. "Mrs. Sullivan," a male voice called from the back door, "we need you to evacuate the house now. Standard procedure." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Evacuate? But where am I supposed to go?" "Helen next door has offered to let you stay with her," Detective Chen said, standing. "Pack anything essential you might need for the next few hours. We don't know how long this will take." Moving through her house in a daze, Margaret grabbed her medications, phone charger, and a light jacket. Each item she picked up seemed somehow significant and insignificant at the same time. Her hands shook as she put them into a small overnight bag. In her bedroom, she paused at the dresser where she kept her family photos. On impulse, she grabbed the old album with pictures of her grandfather. As she lifted it, a loose photograph slipped out. Her grandfather standing proudly next to the newly planted apple tree, his railroader's cap pushed back on his head, dirt on his hands. She'd seen this photo hundreds of times, but now she studied it with new eyes. Was there something in his expression she'd never noticed before? Some shadow behind his smile? Helen met her at the property line with a hug and concerned questions. From her neighbor's living room window, Margaret had a different view of her. Yard, one that made everything look surreal. The bomb squad technicians moved around her beloved tree like surgeons around an operating table. She could see their hand signals, their careful movements, the way they consulted with each other over equipment readings. Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely. Margaret sat in Helen's floral armchair, barely touching the tea and cookies. Her neighbor kept offering, watching the controlled chaos in her yard. Police officers came and went, speaking into radios. More official vehicles arrived. News vans began appearing at the end of the street, reporters setting up cameras just beyond the police tape. Finally, after what felt like hours, there was a subtle shift in the activity outside. The bomb squad technicians stepped back from the tree, and one of them began removing his protective gear. Detective Chen appeared at Helen's door. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, her expression serious but not alarming. "We've confirmed it's World War I-era military equipment. What appears to be a cache of signal equipment and some kind of encoded documents, all sealed in period-appropriate containers. It was deliberately placed inside the tree when it was young, and the tree grew around it over the decades." Margaret stared at the detective, trying to process this information. Military equipment in her grandfather's apple tree, the tree she'd climbed as a child, the tree they'd hung swings from, the tree that had been the heart of their family's home for nearly 90 years. "But why?" she whispered, more to herself than to the detective. "Why would he do that?" Detective Chen sat down across from her. "Mrs. Sullivan, we're going to need to ask you some more questions about your grandfather's service during the war. Sometimes veterans brought things back for various reasons. Sometimes those reasons were more complicated than they appeared." The next morning, Margaret sat at Helen's kitchen table, both women clutching fresh cups of tea as police continued to work in Margaret's yard. The news about the military equipment had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and Helen, Eleanor, as she insisted Margaret call her now, had apparently known more than she'd let on all these years. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one who brought things back," Eleanor said, her voice low even though they were alone in the house. "My father, God rest his soul, he told me stories about what some of the boys carried home. Not just medals or helmets, some of them couldn't let go of the bigger things." Margaret leaned forward. "Did you know my grandfather well back then?" "Oh yes, dear. We moved in right after my father came back from the war, when all these houses were new. Most of the families here were veterans. That's how they could afford the places with the wartime benefits." Eleanor's eyes grew distant with memory. "Your grandfather helped my father plant our rose bushes. They'd spend hours working in their yards, barely talking, just understanding each other, I suppose." Margaret thought about all the silent afternoons she'd witnessed between her grandfather and the neighborhood men. She'd always assumed they were just being typical reserved men of their generation. Now she wondered what unspoken things had passed between them as they traded garden tools and advice about lawn care. "Did you know about the old train yard?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "The one that used to be where the shopping center is now?" Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "The Barrett Rail Depot. Yes, that's where Grandpa worked." "It was more than just a rail yard during the war," Eleanor said. "They used it to store military supplies, communications equipment. Your grandfather was more than just a mechanic there." A knock at the door made both women jump. Detective Chen stood there with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Dr. James Mitchell from the Military History Archives. He's been going through some records we think you should see." In Eleanor's living room, Dr. Mitchell spread several folders across the coffee table. "Mrs. Sullivan, your grandfather's role during World War I was more complex than his official records suggest. He wasn't just a regular soldier. He worked in signals intelligence. After the war, he was part of a program that maintained emergency communication networks in case they were ever needed again." Margaret picked up a yellow document, her hands shaking slightly. "But why hide equipment in our tree?" "The early 1930s were an uncertain time," Dr. Mitchell explained. "There were concerns about another war brewing in Europe. Some veterans, particularly those who'd worked in intelligence, were tasked with maintaining backup communication systems. Your grandfather's position at the rail yard made him an ideal candidate for this role." Margaret remembered something. "He used to tell me stories about the tree being an investment in the future. I always thought he meant it was about hope, about planting something that would grow." "In a way it was," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "but it was also about protecting something he believed might be needed someday. The equipment we found was part of an emergency communication network, cutting-edge technology for its time, carefully preserved." Through Eleanor's front window, Margaret watched as specialists continued to work in her yard. The tree was completely gone now, its absence like a missing tooth in the landscape of her childhood. The experts had moved on to carefully excavating the root system, where preliminary scans had indicated more metal objects might be hidden. "There's something else," Detective Chen said, pulling out a file. "We found these in the county archives. Your grandfather was part of a larger network of veterans who maintained similar caches across the country. They called it Operation Seedling, and then hiding communication equipment in plain sight, often in trees or other natural growing things that would disguise them as they matured." Margaret opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of other trees across the country, each with its own hidden cache of equipment. Her grandfather's neat handwriting appeared on several documents: technical diagrams, maintenance logs, coded messages. "So he wasn't just protecting himself," Margaret said softly. "He was protecting everyone, preparing for a future he hoped would never come." Dr. Mitchell nodded. "Your grandfather and others like him understood something profound about preparation and hope. They didn't just bury equipment, they grew life around it. Each tree was both a guardian and a symbol of faith in the future." Margaret thought about all the years her grandfather had tended that tree, checking it every spring, pruning it every fall, teaching her to make apple pies from its fruit. He had been both maintaining his secret duty and creating something beautiful, something that would feed and shelter his family. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at the activity in her yard. "The equipment will be preserved in the Military History Museum," Dr. Mitchell said. "It's an important piece of our understanding of how veterans continued to serve their country, even after they came home. Some of these communication devices are unique. They tell us a lot about the technology of the period and the foresight of men like your grandfather." Detective Chen added, "Once the area is cleared and secured, you'll be able to return home. The Historical Society has already expressed interest in documenting this story. They believe it could help people understand a previously unknown aspect of how our community prepared for uncertain times." Margaret picked up the old photograph of her grandfather again, studying his face with new understanding. The quiet railroad mechanic who had taught her to garden, who had built her swings and made her laugh with stories, had been something more. A guardian, a keeper of secrets, a man who had found a way to balance duty with the simple beauty of watching things grow. 4 months after the discovery, Margaret stood in her backyard, watching volunteers from the local historical society plant a young apple tree. They'd chosen the same heritage variety her grandfather had planted all those years ago, though they placed it in a different spot. The old location, now filled in and covered with fresh sod, would become part of a small memorial garden. "Ah, you absolutely sure about this?" Catherine asked, standing beside her mother. Margaret's daughter had come home to help with the replanting ceremony. "Nobody would blame you if you wanted to just move away after everything that happened." Margaret watched as the volunteers carefully positioned the sapling, making sure it stood straight and strong. "This is home," she said simply. "Your great-grandfather understood something important about healing. Sometimes you have to plant new life right where the old wounds are." The previous months had been a whirlwind of activity. After the military equipment was safely removed and catalogued, Margaret had worked with Dr. Mitchell and the Historical Society to document everything. Her grandfather's personal papers and photographs became the centerpiece of a special exhibition about the hidden networks that had connected veteran communities in the years between the wars. Veterans' families from across the country had come forward with their own stories of secrets kept and duties maintained. The local middle school had even started bringing students to see the exhibition. Margaret found herself telling her grandfather's story to wide-eyed 8th graders, watching them understand for the first time how history lived in their own backyards. She showed them the photographs, the documents, the careful diagrams he'd drawn of communication networks disguised as ordinary things. "Look," Catherine said, pointing to the growing crowd gathering for the ceremony. "Is that Mrs. Henderson?" Eleanor was indeed making her way across the lawn, leaning on her cane, but moving with determination. Behind her came other neighbors, more families connected to the veterans who'd once made this community their refuge. They carried pictures, letters, small mementos of their own loved ones who'd served. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Dr. Mitchell spoke about the historical significance of what they'd found, about how one man's choice to hide vital equipment inside a growing thing had revealed a larger story of veterans who'd continued to serve their country in quiet, hidden ways. Eleanor shared memories of the neighborhood in those early post-war years, of the unspoken understanding between men who'd carried responsibilities few knew about. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she found herself telling not just her grandfather's story, but the story of the tree itself, how it had sheltered and nourished their family through decades of changes, how it had been more than just a guardian of secrets. "My grandfather brought something important home from the war," she told the gathered crowd, "but he didn't let that define the tree's purpose. He chose to grow something beautiful around it, something that would feed people, shelter them, bring The joy. That's the real legacy he left us, not the equipment he hid, but the life he grew above it. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Margaret walked the perimeter of her yard. The police tape was long gone, the excavation holes filled in, new grass sprouting around the young apple tree. Volunteers were putting the finishing touches on a simple garden. They'd used some of the old tree's wood to make benches, and a small plaque told the story of what had been found there. Catherine joined her mother's walk, linking their arms together. You know what I keep thinking about? All those summer afternoons we spent doing homework under that tree. Grandpa was always so calm about it, but he must have been watching over more than just us. Margaret smiled, remembering her grandfather's constant presence in the yard, his careful attention to the tree's health. He made sure we were safe, that everyone was safe. He just did it so quietly that none of us realized what he was really guarding. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the young apple tree, and Margaret felt a familiar peace settle over her. The yard looked different now. The old tree gone, the new sapling still small, the memorial garden adding a new purpose to the space. But it felt right, like her grandfather's story had finally found its proper place in the light of day. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone and the tools were packed away, Margaret sat on one of the new benches with a cup of tea. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and somewhere nearby a robin was singing. The young apple tree cast a delicate shadow across the memorial garden, its branches already reaching for the light. She pulled out her grandfather's old photograph one last time, but now she read his expression with new understanding. The quiet railroad mechanic who had taught her to garden, who had built her swings and filled her childhood with stories, had been something more, a guardian, a keeper of vital secrets, a man who had found a way to balance duty with the simple beauty of watching things grow. Tomorrow she would go back to helping the Historical Society organize their exhibition. There would be more school groups to talk to, more veterans' families seeking to understand their own stories. The work of remembering and honoring these quiet heroes would continue. But for now, she sat peacefully in her renewed garden, watching the young tree's leaves dance in the evening breeze, carrying on her grandfather's legacy of growing hope from the seeds of service. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Margaret gathered her teacup and stood. The young apple tree seemed to whisper in the evening breeze, promising years of growth, shade, and sweet fruit to come. Just as her grandfather had understood all those years ago, sometimes the most powerful acts of service are the ones that grow quietly day by day, bearing fruit for generations to come. Over the next year, Margaret's discovery sparked a wave of similar revelations across the country. Other families, inspired by her grandfather's story, began examining their own inherited trees and gardens with new eyes. The Military History Museum created a special exhibit called Operation Seedling, the secret network of America's world. War-eye veterans, featuring the equipment found in her grandfather's apple tree as its centerpiece. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret sat on her memorial bench enjoying her morning tea, a letter arrived from a small town in Virginia. Inside was a photograph of another apple tree, planted in 1933, and a story that paralleled her own. The writer, a woman named Dorothy, had discovered similar communication equipment hidden within her family's old pear tree after it was damaged in a storm. "Your story gave me the courage to come forward," Dorothy wrote. "My grandfather and yours must have been part of the same network. I found his old journals after your story made the news. They talked about something called the Orchard Network. There's a whole system of fruit trees across the country, each hiding pieces of an emergency communication system." Margaret found herself corresponding with more families like Dorothy's. Each letter brought new pieces of the puzzle, helping to reconstruct the elaborate network her grandfather and his fellow veterans had created. The Historical Society helped her compile these stories, creating a map that showed dozens of similar trees planted across the country, each one part of this hidden communication web. Dr. Mitchell became a regular visitor, bringing newly uncovered documents and helping Margaret understand the broader historical context of what her grandfather had been part of. It wasn't just about hiding equipment, he explained one day, sharing a recently discovered military memo. These men were creating a backup system they hoped would never be needed, but they did it in a way that also enriched their communities. Every tree they planted provided food, shade, and beauty while guarding its secrets. The young apple tree in Margaret's yard flourished, growing stronger with each passing season. Its first spring brought a modest display of blossoms, and by fall it bore a small crop of apples. Margaret picked them carefully, saving everyone. On a cool October afternoon, she invited Eleanor and Catherine over to help her bake the first pie from the new tree's fruit. "It's not quite the same as the old tree's apples," Catherine said, taking a bite of the warm pie. "No," Margaret agreed, "but it's good in its own way. Different, but good." The memorial garden had become a gathering place for the community. Veterans' families would often stop by, sitting on the benches made from the old tree's wood, sharing stories of their own. Family members who had served. Local school children came on field trips, learning about the hidden history in their own backyards. One day, an elderly man visited the garden, leaning heavily on a cane. He introduced himself as Thomas Barrett, no relation, but he had served with men who were part of the same network as her grandfather. "We called ourselves the Orchard Keepers," he explained, sitting on one of the benches. "Your grandfather was one of the best. He understood that our job wasn't just about hiding equipment, it was about maintaining hope. Every tree we planted was a bet on the future, a belief that something good could grow even in uncertain times." Margaret began recording these conversations, preserving the memories of the few remaining veterans who knew about Operation Seedling. Each story added new depth to her understanding of what her grandfather and his contemporaries had achieved. Not just a military backup plan, but a living legacy of service disguised as simple acts of gardening. The Military History Museum created a traveling exhibition about Operation Seedling, featuring photographs of the trees, the equipment they had hidden, and the stories of the veterans who had maintained this secret network. When it came to Margaret's town, she was asked to speak at the opening. Standing at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd, Margaret felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy. "These men came home from a terrible war," she said, "carrying not just memories, but a continued commitment to serve. They could have hidden their equipment in bunkers or buried it in the ground. Instead, they chose to encase it in living things, in trees that would grow and bear fruit, in gardens that would feed and shelter their communities. They turned a military necessity into something beautiful." After her speech, a young girl approached, her clutching a school notebook. "My grandpa was in Iraq," she said. "He has a garden too, and he never lets anyone dig in certain spots." "Do you think—" Margaret smiled gently. "Maybe he just likes his garden the way it is. But maybe, like my grandfather, he found his own way to transform his service into something that grows. Sometimes the best ways to heal are the ones that bloom year after year." That evening, sitting in her garden as the sun set, Margaret watched a family of robins building a nest in the young apple tree's branches. Life continued its cycle, she thought, building new stories on the foundations of old ones. Her grandfather's tree might be gone, but its legacy lived on, not just in the military equipment it had hidden, but in the way it had brought a community together, helping them understand the quiet heroism of ordinary men who had found extraordinary ways to serve. The young apple tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the darkening sky. Margaret smiled, knowing that while some secrets were meant to be discovered, Others lived on in the simple act of planting something, new, of believing in growth and renewal, of finding ways to make beauty bloom from the seeds of sacrifice. 2 years after the discovery in her old apple tree, Margaret sat in the Military History Museum's new permanent exhibition, Growing Secrets, the hidden networks of World War I veterans. Her grandfather's story had sparked a nationwide effort to document and preserve the tales of what historians now called the Sentinel Trees Project. The exhibition space was designed to resemble an orchard with life-sized photographs of trees, covering the walls and soft, dappled lighting, creating the illusion of sunlight filtering through leaves. Display cases held carefully preserved pieces of communication equipment found in various trees across the country, each with its own story to tell. A group of high school students moved through the exhibition, their teacher explaining how veterans, like William Barrett, had transformed military necessity into living monuments. Margaret smiled as she overheard one student ask, "But why didn't they just bury the equipment in bunkers?" "Because they were thinking beyond the equipment," their teacher explained, unknowingly echoing Margaret's own growing understanding. They were creating something that served multiple purposes: protection, preservation, and renewal. Dr. Mitchell approached Margaret's bench carrying a leather-bound book. "We've finished compiling the National Registry," he said, sitting beside her. "Over 200 trees have been identified so far, each part of the network your grandfather helped create. But it's the pattern that's truly remarkable." He opened the book to reveal a map of the United States, dotted with small symbols representing each discovered tree. "They created a living grid," he explained, tracing lines between the points. Each tree was positioned to maintain line of sight, connections with at least 2 others, creating redundant communication pathways across the entire country. Margaret studied the map, seeing her grandfather's apple tree as just one point in an intricate web of connection and protection. They weren't just thinking about hiding equipment, she realized. They were thinking about how to keep people connected, even in the worst circumstances. The museum had recreated her grandfather's workshop as part of the exhibition, using his actual tools and workbench, donated by Margaret after the discovery. His railroader's cap hung on a peg, and his gardening tools were arranged exactly as she remembered them. A video screen showed interviews with family members of other Sentinel Tree veterans, sharing their stories of discovery and understanding. As Margaret watched, Eleanor Henderson's face appeared on the screen, sharing memories of the neighborhood in those early years. "We all knew they carried burdens from the war," her voice crackled through the speakers, "but we never imagined they had found such a beautiful way to transform those burdens into blessings." The exhibition had drawn attention from unexpected quarters. Environmental historians studied how the trees had adapted to grow around the equipment they contained. Military strategists analyzed the ingenious communication network these veterans had created. But for Margaret, the most meaningful response came from other military families who saw in these trees a reflection of their own experiences with service and sacrifice. A special section of the exhibition was dedicated to modern-day veterans who had been inspired by the Sentinel trees to create their own projects combining service with renewal. A Marine from Afghanistan had started a community orchard program. An Army sergeant had developed a therapy garden for fellow veterans. Each, in their own way, was carrying forward the legacy of men like William Barrett. "Your grandfather would be proud," Dr. Mitchell said, closing the registry book, "not just of how we've preserved the equipment he protected, but of how his story has inspired others to find their own ways of growing good from difficult experiences." Margaret nodded, thinking of her own young apple tree at home, now strong enough to support a swing for her grandchildren. "He always said that growth was the best answer to darkness," she remembered. "I just never knew how many layers that wisdom had." As she prepared to leave the museum, a curator hurried over with an envelope. "This just arrived from a family in Oregon," she said excitedly. "They found something in their old cherry tree after it was damaged in a storm. The markings match the equipment from your grandfather's tree exactly." Margaret opened the envelope to find photographs of more World War I-era communication equipment, carefully preserved inside another living sentinel. The accompanying letter told a familiar story. A quiet veteran, a carefully tended tree, family discovering that their simple fruit tree had been part of something much larger. Back home, Margaret added the letter to her growing collection of correspondence from families across the country. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of understanding she was weaving about her grandfather's generation. Men who had returned from war, determined to create something lasting and life-affirming from their experiences. The sunset painted her garden in soft gold as she sat on her memorial bench, watching her great-grandchildren play beneath the young apple tree. Its branches were already strong enough to hold their weight, its roots deep enough to sustain their dreams. Like the network it represented, it was both a connection to the past and a promise to the future. A light breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment Margaret could almost hear her grandfather's voice in their rustling. "Life grows forward, Maggie," he used to say. "Our job is just to plant the seeds and tend them well." Now she understood that he had been planting more than trees. He had been sowing hope, cultivating connection, and growing a legacy that would continue to bear fruit for generations to come. As the story of the sentinel trees spread, researchers began uncovering more layers of the network's sophistication. One autumn morning, Margaret received an urgent call from Dr. Mitchell. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've made an extraordinary discovery. Could you come to the museum today?" In his office, surrounded by maps and documents, Dr. Mitchell could barely contain his excitement. "We've been analyzing the geographical positioning of all the known trees," he explained, spreading a detailed map across his desk. "Your grandfather's journals mentioned something called the harmonious grid, but we never understood what it meant until now." He pointed to various markers on the map, each representing a documented sentinel tree. "Look at the pattern. The trees weren't just positioned for line-of-sight communication. They were planted according to musical intervals, the same mathematical ratios found in classical harmony. Each tree's position corresponds to a note on a musical scale." Margaret leaned closer, seeing her grandfather's apple tree as one note in an enormous musical composition written across the American landscape. "But why? What was the purpose?" "We believed they were creating a sophisticated encoding system," Dr. Mitchell explained. "By using musical harmonies as a basis for their network, they could transmit messages that would appear meaningless without understanding the musical key. It was brilliant, hiding their communication system not just physically within the trees, but mathematically within the very layout of the network itself." This revelation led to a new phase of research. Musicians were brought in to study the pattern, and composers created pieces based on the geographical arrangements of the trees. The museum hosted a special concert where these sentinel symphonies were performed, each note corresponding to a tree in the network. Margaret sat in the front row as the orchestra played the first piece. As the music swelled, she closed her eyes and imagined the network coming alive, each tree humming with its own note, creating a harmony that stretched across the continent. Her grandfather's apple tree had been part of this silent symphony for decades, its note resonating with others in a song only now being heard. The discovery of the musical connection brought new visitors to Margaret's memorial garden. Music students would come to stand where the old tree had grown, listening for echoes of its particular note in the whisper of the young tree's leaves. Composers would sit on the benches, finding inspiration in the story of veterans who had turned military necessity into both visual and mathematical art. One day, a group of high school students arrived with their physics teacher. They set up sensitive equipment around the garden, explaining to Margaret that they were studying the harmonic frequencies of trees. Your grandfather and his fellow veterans understood something profound about natural harmonics, the teacher explained. They weren't just hiding equipment. They were working with the fundamental mathematics of nature itself. The students' research revealed that the particular variety of apple tree chosen for the network had natural resonant frequencies that aligned perfectly with the communication equipment hidden within. The trees hadn't just concealed the equipment, they had actually helped to enhance its capabilities. It's like they created a living antenna network, one student explained enthusiastically. The trees weren't just hiding places. They were a part of the communication system itself. This understanding of the network's sophistication led to a new appreciation for the veterans who had designed it. These weren't just soldiers burying equipment. They were engineers, mathematicians, and artists creating a complex system that merged technology with nature in ways that were only now being fully understood. Margaret found herself returning to her grandfather's journals with new eyes, recognizing subtle references to music and harmony she had previously overlooked. His careful notes about pruning and maintenance took on new meaning. He hadn't just been tending a tree, he had been tuning an instrument in an enormous continental orchestra. The young apple tree in her garden, though not part of the original network, seemed to carry its own music. On quiet mornings, Margaret would sit beneath it with her tea, listening to the wind in its leaves, imagining the complex harmonies that had once stretched across the nation, carried by trees just like her grandfather's. The Military History Museum added a new section to their exhibition, exploring the mathematical and musical aspects of the Sentinel tree network. Interactive displays allowed visitors to hear the harmonies created by different combinations of trees, to understand how messages could have been encoded within these natural frequencies. Your grandfather and his colleagues created something far more sophisticated than we initially realized, Dr. Mitchell told Margaret one day. They didn't just hide their equipment in nature. They worked with nature's own patterns to create something entirely new. It was a perfect fusion of military necessity, scientific understanding, and artistic vision. As Margaret walked through the exhibition, watching visitors discover new aspects of the network's complexity, she felt a deep pride in her grandfather's generation. These men had returned from war and created something that transcended their military experience. A symphony written in living things, a code hidden in the mathematics of growth and harmony. The young apple tree in her garden continued to grow, its branches reaching toward the sky in their own quiet dance with the wind. Though it wasn't part of the original harmonic network, Margaret liked to think it carried its own note, a new song for a new generation, growing from the rich soil, of understanding that her grandfather and his fellow veterans had prepared. We're still learning from them, she told a group of visitors one day. Not just about history or military strategy, but about how to transform necessity into beauty, how to hide complexity in simplicity, how to make music from the very earth itself. The legacy of the sentinel trees had grown far beyond its original purpose, teaching new lessons about the intersection of nature, mathematics, music, and human ingenuity. In the end, Margaret thought, that might have been her grandfather's greatest achievement, creating something that continued to reveal new layers of meaning like rings in a growing tree, long after its original purpose had passed into history. On the 5th anniversary of the discovery in her grandfather's apple tree, Margaret hosted a special gathering in her memorial garden. Representatives from military museums, historical societies, and veterans organizations across the country had come to commemorate what had become known as the revelation of the sentinel trees. The young apple tree she'd planted, now strong and beginning to spread its canopy, provided shade for the assembled guests. Among them was Dorothy from Virginia, whose letter years ago had helped confirm the existence of the broader network. They had become close friends, sharing their parallel journeys of discovery about their grandfather's secret service. "I never thought that losing an old tree would lead to all this," Dorothy said, gesturing at the gathered crowd. "Our grandfathers would be amazed to see how their secret network has brought so many people together." Dr. Mitchell took the podium they'd set up near the memorial benches. His hair had grown grayer over the years of research, but his enthusiasm remained unchanged. 5 years ago, when Mrs. Sullivan's tree service made their unexpected discovery, we thought we'd found a single piece of hidden World War I history. Instead, we uncovered a nationwide network of veterans who had transformed military necessity into a living testament of service and hope. He unveiled a new plaque for the garden, this one detailing not just the story of William Barrett's apple tree, but its connection to the larger harmonic network. The mathematical equations that governed the tree's placement were engraved alongside musical notation, showing how the veterans had woven their communication system into the very fabric of nature. A string quartet from the local university played, a piece composed from the harmonic patterns of the network. The music seemed to dance with the rustling leaves overhead, creating a conversation between past and present, between human artifice and natural growth. During the reception that followed, Margaret found herself speaking with a young military officer who had driven from Washington, D.C. for the ceremony. "What your grandfather and his fellow veterans created wasn't just ingenious from a technical standpoint," he explained. "It's changing how we think about resilient communication systems today. They understood something fundamental about working with nature rather than against it." The officer shared that modern military planners were studying the sentinel tree network as an example of sustainable organic infrastructure. The veterans' approach of hiding technology within living systems had inspired new approaches to creating communications networks that could withstand natural disasters and other disruptions. As evening approached and the crowds began to thin, Margaret sat with Eleanor on their favorite bench. Her neighbor's health had declined in recent years, but she had insisted on attending the ceremony. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "I remember watching your grandfather tend that tree every single day. Rain or shine, he'd be out there checking the branches, testing the soil. We all thought he was just being particular about his gardening." "He was protecting something larger than just our family," Margaret replied, watching the sunset paint the young apple tree's leaves in shades of gold. They all were, every veteran who planted a tree in this network. They were growing hope for the future. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Margaret walked her garden alone. The plaques gleamed in the moonlight, telling the story of her grandfather's tree and its place in the larger symphony of service. The young apple tree cast familiar shadows on the ground, different from its predecessor, but carrying its own promise of growth and renewal. She thought about how loss sometimes led to discovery, how endings could become beginnings. The death of her grandfather's old apple tree had revealed not just its hidden contents, but an entire network of connection and purpose that had been quietly growing across the country for decades. The military equipment found within the trees had long since been preserved in museums, but the true legacy of the sentinel trees lived on in other ways. Veterans groups had started programs planting new trees in communities across the country. While these weren't part of any secret network, they carried forward the spirit of transformation that William Barrett and his fellow veterans had embodied. The idea that service could grow into something beautiful and lasting. Margaret had kept a small piece of her grandfather's original apple tree carved into a smooth pendant she wore around her neck. Some evenings, like tonight, she would hold it while sitting in her garden, feeling the connection to all the other families who had discovered similar secrets in their own trees, to all the veterans who had found ways to turn the machinery of war into the seeds of peace. The harmony of the network still resonated across the country, She thought not in hidden equipment anymore, but in the stories it had revealed, in the connections it had fostered, in the understanding it had created about how healing could take root and grow in unexpected ways. As crickets began their evening song, Margaret remembered something her grandfather used to say when she was young. "Everything that grows has a purpose, Maggie, even if we can't see it yet." She hadn't understood then how many layers of meaning were buried in those words, like rings in a tree's heart, waiting to be discovered. The young apple tree swayed gently in the night breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the stars. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more stories, more discoveries about the network that had grown quietly across the nation for so many years. But tonight, in the peace of her garden, Margaret simply sat with the knowledge that some secrets once revealed could bloom into something far more beautiful than their keepers had ever imagined. Her grandfather's tree had taught her that sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones that grow slowly, taking root in quiet places, spreading their branches toward the future, waiting for the right moment to reveal their deeper purpose. In the end, she thought, that might be the greatest lesson of the sentinel trees, that hope, like an apple tree, grows best when it's planted with purpose and tended with patience, its fruits ripening in their own perfect time. 10 years after the discovery in her grandfather's apple tree, Margaret stood in her garden on a crisp autumn morning, watching her great-grandchildren collect fallen apples from beneath the now mature tree. The young tree she'd planted had grown strong and tall, its branches heavy with fruit, carrying forward a legacy that had transformed far beyond its origins. A decade of research and documentation had revealed the full scope of the sentinel trees network. Over 300 trees had been identified across the country, each one planted by a World War I veteran, each containing carefully preserved communication equipment, each positioned according to the mathematical harmonies that had made the network so remarkable. "Grandma Margaret," called 6-year-old William, named after his great-great-grandfather, "tell us again about the secret tree." He held up a perfect red apple, his face bright with curiosity and wonder. Margaret sat on her memorial bench, patting the space beside her. The children gathered around, a new generation, learning the story that had become part of their family's legacy. "Well," she began, "many years ago, before any of you were born, there was an apple tree right over there." She pointed to the spot, now marked by a bronze plaque. "It was planted by your great-great-grandfather William, and it held a very special secret." As she told the story once again, Margaret noticed a car pulling into her driveway. Dr. Mitchell emerged, now fully white-haired but still moving with purpose, carrying a leather briefcase she'd come to recognize as containing new discoveries about the network. "Mrs. Sullivan!" he called out, walking carefully along the garden path. "We've found something extraordinary, something that changes everything we thought we knew about the network." The children scattered to play as Dr. Mitchell spread documents across the picnic table they'd installed near the memorial benches. "We've been digitizing your grandfather's journals," he explained, "and our computer analysis revealed a pattern we'd missed. The harmonies in the network weren't just for communication, they were recording something." He showed her spectral analyses of the network's harmonic patterns. The mathematical relationships between the trees, when played as music, create more than just a code. They're a kind of audio time capsule. The veterans weren't just hiding equipment, they were preserving memories. Margaret leaned forward, studying the complex diagrams. "What kind of memories?" "Songs from the war," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Folk tunes, military marches, even fragments of local music from the villages where they served. They encoded these melodies into the very spacing of the trees. It's as if they created a vast musical archive, written in living things across the American landscape." This revelation sparked a new phase of research. Musicians and mathematicians worked together to play the patterns of the network, reconstructing melodies that hadn't been heard in over a century. The Museum of Military History organized a special concert series, Songs of the Sentinel Trees, where these recovered pieces were performed alongside historical photographs and letters. Margaret attended the first concert with her entire family. As the orchestra played melodies that had been hidden in the mathematical relationships between the trees, she closed her eyes and imagined her grandfather and his fellow veterans carefully plotting each planting, ensuring that their experiences, their memories, their music would be preserved in a way that would nurture future generations. The discovery of the musical archive led to new connections with families in Europe. French historians found records of the villages where American soldiers had heard these songs, and some of the communities still preserved their own versions of the melodies. Cultural exchange programs were established, linking communities connected by these threads of music and memory. In Margaret's garden, the young apple tree continued to thrive, its fruit sweeter with each passing year. Though it wasn't part of the original network, it had become a different kind of sentinel, a guardian of memory, a living link between generations, a reminder of how secrets could bloom into understanding. The memorial garden had grown as well, with new plaques explaining the musical dimensions of the network. On quiet evenings, visitors would sometimes bring instruments, playing the recovered melodies beneath the apple tree's branches, adding their own harmonies to the ongoing story. Your grandfather and his companions created something unprecedented, Dr. Mitchell told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the garden in golden light. They took their experiences of war and transformed them into a symphony of growth and renewal. Every tree in the network was both a guardian of technology and a note in their composition of hope. Margaret fingered the wooden pendant she still wore, carved from her grandfather's original tree. He always said that music was the closest thing to magic we had, she remembered. I never knew he meant it so literally. As she watched her great-grandchildren playing beneath the new apple tree, Margaret reflected on how loss could lead to discovery, how endings could open doors to unexpected understanding. The death of her grandfather's tree had revealed not just its hidden equipment, but an entire tapestry of memory and meaning, woven into the landscape through mathematics, music, and growing things. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the evening breeze stirred the apple tree's leaves in its ancient dance. Somewhere in that whispered movement, Margaret thought she could hear echoes of the songs her grandfather had helped preserve, melodies of memory carried forward on the wings of time, nurtured by the quiet wisdom of veterans who had found a way to make music grow from the soil of sacrifice. The legacy of the sentinel trees had grown far beyond its original purpose, teaching new lessons about the intersection of memory, mathematics, music, and the enduring human need to preserve what matters most. In the end, Margaret thought that might have been her grandfather's greatest gift, creating something that continued to reveal new harmonies like rings in a growing tree, singing its quiet song to generations yet to come. 15 years had passed since the discovery in Margaret's apple tree, and the Sentinel Trees network had become part of the national consciousness. Schools taught it in history classes, museums dedicated permanent exhibitions to it, and the mathematical principles behind its musical encoding had inspired new approaches to environmental design and communication technology. On this particular morning, Margaret sat in her garden, now a recognized historical site, watching a film crew set up their equipment. They were producing a documentary about the network, and her grandfather's tree had become the cornerstone of the story. The young apple tree she'd planted, now mature and flourishing, provided shade for the interview setup. "Mrs. Sullivan," the director approached, "we'd like to begin with your initial reaction to discovering the secret in your grandfather's tree. Then we'll explore how that discovery led to understanding the larger network. As Margaret shared her story once again, she noticed how the narrative had evolved over the years. What had begun as a shocking discovery of hidden military equipment had grown into a much richer story about memory, music, and the unexpected ways that healing could take root and grow. The documentary team had brought along a physicist who specialized in harmonic resonance. He explained how the veterans had used their understanding of natural frequencies to create a sophisticated communication network hidden within living things. They were decades ahead of their time, he explained, setting up instruments to measure the harmonic patterns of Margaret's new apple tree. We're only now beginning to fully appreciate the elegance of their solution. Between filming sessions, Margaret walked through her garden with Eleanor's granddaughter Sarah, who had continued her grandmother's tradition of preserving neighborhood histories. "You know," Sarah said, "every time I think we've uncovered everything there is to know about the network, something new emerges. It's like the trees themselves are slowly revealing their secrets." The legacy of the sentinel trees had indeed continued to grow in unexpected ways. Environmental scientists studied how the trees had adapted to protect the equipment within them. Musicians composed new pieces based on the harmonic patterns of the network. Veterans groups used the story to explore different ways of processing and transforming the experience of war. As the sun began to set and the film crew packed up their equipment, Margaret sat on her memorial bench, holding the wooden pendant carved from her grandfather's original tree. The evening breeze rustled through the leaves above, and for a moment she could almost hear the complex harmonies that connected this spot to hundreds of others across the country. A symphony of growth and memory that continued to resonate through time. The story of the sentinel trees, like the network itself, had grown into something far more profound than its creators might have imagined. A testament to the power of transformation, to the way hope could take root in unexpected places and flourish across generations. As Margaret watched the last golden light fade from her garden, she smiled, knowing that this story, like her grandfather's tree, would continue to bear fruit for years to come. 20 years after the discovery in her grandfather's apple tree, Margaret sat in her garden for what she knew might be one of the last times. At 92, her steps had grown slower, but her mind remained sharp as ever. The garden had become a national historic site, and tomorrow it would officially be transferred to the care of the Historical Society, ensuring its preservation for future generations. The apple tree she'd planted after the discovery had grown into a magnificent specimen, its branches spreading wide over the memorial garden. Today, it was heavy with fruit, just as her grandfather's tree had been all those. Years ago, her great-grandchildren had helped harvest the apples this morning, filling baskets that would be used to bake pies for tomorrow's ceremony. As the evening light painted the garden in soft gold, Margaret touched the wooden pendant at her neck. One last time, the small piece of her grandfather's original tree had become smooth with years of handling, carrying within it the memories of a secret that had transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. "Well, Grandpa Will," she whispered to the setting sun, "your secret grew into something beautiful." The breeze stirred the apple tree's leaves, their whispered song carrying echoes of harmonies that stretched across time and distance, connecting past to present, sacrifice to renewal, and the endless cycle of growth that turned simple seeds into lasting legacies. Margaret smiled as she heard her family calling her in for dinner. Tomorrow would bring change, but that too was part of growth. The story of the sentinel trees would continue, sprouting new understanding in each generation, just as her grandfather had intended when he first planted a tree to guard his secrets and grow hope for the future. If you enjoyed this incredible story about Margaret and her grandfather's apple tree, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating historical discoveries and untold stories that will touch your heart. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. We share new stories every week that reveal the extraordinary in seemingly ordinary lives. Help us grow our community of storytellers and history lovers by leaving a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the Sentinel Trees Network. Has this story changed how you look at the trees in your own neighborhood? Remember to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a good story about family legacies, hidden history, and the surprising ways the past connects to our present. See you in our next video.